On April 26, 121 CE, in the heart of Rome, a child was born who would one day rule the largest empire the world had ever known. Marcus Annius Verus entered the world during Emperor Hadrian's reign, when Rome stretched from Scotland's highlands to Egypt's deserts. His first cries echoed through marble halls on the Celian Hill, where the wealthy Annius family had built their ancestral home. The Annius family represented the peak of Roman aristocratic society. Marcus's father, also named Marcus Annius Verus, held the prestigious rank of praetor and could trace his lineage through generations of distinguished public servants. Their wealth came from vast agricultural estates across Spain, where olive groves and wheat fields generated the fortune that supported their luxurious lifestyle in the capital. His grandfather, Marcus Annius Verus the Elder, had served as consul twice and prefect of the city, placing him among the most powerful men in the empire. Marcus's mother, Domitia Lucilla, proved equally significant in shaping the future emperor's character. She descended from the prominent Domitii family, whose members had served as senators, consuls, and military commanders for centuries. Domitia Lucilla possessed not only aristocratic breeding, but also considerable intellectual gifts, speaking fluent Greek and maintaining correspondence with philosophers and poets throughout the Mediterranean. Her family controlled extensive brick-making operations that supplied construction projects across Rome, including some of Hadrian's ambitious architectural ventures. When Marcus was barely 3 years old, tragedy struck. His father died suddenly, leaving the young boy in the care of his mother and grandfather. This early loss profoundly influenced Marcus's development, instilling in him a precocious awareness of mortality and the transient nature of human affairs. His grandfather stepped into the paternal role with dedication and wisdom that would leave lasting marks on his grandson's character. The elder Annius Verus embodied traditional Roman virtues of gravitas, dignitas, and pietas. He rose before dawn each day to attend to correspondence and legal matters, often taking young Marcus with him to observe the conduct of serious business. The grandfather's study, lined with scrolls containing works of Cicero, Livy, and other classical authors, became Marcus's first classroom. Here, surrounded by the musty scent of papyrus and the soft scratch of stylus on wax tablet, the boy learned to read and write in both Latin and Greek. The household maintained strict routines that reflected aristocratic values and expectations. Breakfast consisted of bread, honey, and diluted wine consumed while discussing the day's agenda and reviewing lessons from the previous day. Marcus learned early that privilege carried responsibility, observing as his grandfather received clients seeking legal advice, financial assistance, or political support. These morning audiences, conducted in the atrium beneath painted frescoes depicting family ancestors, provided practical education in leadership and civic duty. Physical training formed an essential component of Marcus's early education. Roman aristocrats considered athletic prowess crucial for future military and political leadership. Under skilled trainers, Marcus learned to ride horses, handle weapons, and engage in wrestling matches with other boys from prominent families. The family's private gymnasium, equipped with bronze weights and practice weapons, witnessed daily sessions that developed both physical strength and competitive spirit. The cultural atmosphere of Hadrian's Rome provided an intellectually stimulating environment for a precocious child. The emperor himself embodied Greek learning and philosophical inquiry, encouraging artistic and intellectual pursuits throughout the empire. Greek tutors, many of them freed slaves who had received exceptional educations, served in wealthy households across the city. Marcus's family employed several such tutors, each specializing in different subjects essential for aristocratic education. Grammar and rhetoric formed the foundation of Marcus's formal studies. His Greek tutor, a learned man from Athens named Diognetus, introduced him to Homer's epic poems, Plato's dialogues, and the historical works of Herodotus and Thucydides. These texts were not merely read, but memorized, analyzed, and debated. Marcus learned to parse complex grammatical constructions, identify rhetorical devices, and construct persuasive arguments on assigned topics. The boy demonstrated exceptional facility with languages, quickly mastering the nuances of Greek syntax and developing an appreciation for the subtle differences between various dialects. mathematics, and geometry received equal attention in Marcus's curriculum. Roman education emphasized practical applications of mathematical knowledge, preparing students for careers in engineering, architecture, or military logistics. Marcus learned to calculate areas and volumes, construct geometric figures with compass and straightedge, and solve problems involving proportions and ratios. These skills would later prove valuable in understanding siege warfare, urban planning, and economic administration. Music and poetry rounded out Marcus's cultural education. He learned to play the lyre, an instrument considered essential for cultivated gentlemen, and studied the principles of musical harmony and rhythm. Poetry lessons involved not only reading classical works, but also composing original verses in both Latin and Greek. Marcus showed particular aptitude for elegiac couplets and developed a lifelong appreciation for the emotional power of carefully crafted language. The turning point in Marcus's intellectual development occurred around his 12th birthday, when he encountered Junius Rusticus, a senator and philosopher who would become his most influential mentor. Rusticus belonged to the Stoic philosophical tradition, which emphasized virtue, reason, and acceptance of fate as the keys to human happiness. Unlike many aristocratic Romans who treated philosophy as intellectual decoration, Rusticus lived according to Stoic principles, maintaining equanimity in political setbacks and personal disappointments. Rusticus introduced Marcus to the writings of Epictetus, a former slave who had become one of the most respected Stoic teachers of the previous generation. Epictetus's teachings, preserved in lecture notes compiled by his student Arrian, presented philosophy not as abstract speculation, but as practical guidance for daily living. The core Stoic doctrine that individuals could control their responses to events even when they could not control the events themselves resonated deeply with the young Marcus. Under Rusticus's guidance, Marcus began keeping a philosophical journal, recording thoughts about virtue, duty, and the proper conduct of life. These early writings, though lost to history, provided the foundation for the mature philosophical reflections that would eventually become known as the Meditations. Rusticus emphasized the importance of self-examination and honest assessment of one's motives and actions, practices that became lifelong habits for Marcus. The relationship between teacher and student extended beyond formal philosophical instruction. Rusticus served as a model of how to integrate philosophical principles with practical responsibilities. As a serving senator, he demonstrated how Stoic ideals could guide political decision-making without compromising effectiveness or pragmatism. Marcus observed how his mentor maintained dignity during heated Senate debates, showed compassion toward political opponents, and accepted both praise and criticism with equal composure. Emperor Hadrian first noticed Marcus during a religious ceremony at the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill. The 12-year-old boy, dressed in the purple-striped toga of aristocratic youth, caught the emperor's attention through his serious demeanor and respectful behavior during the lengthy ritual proceedings. While other children fidgeted or whispered among themselves, Marcus remained focused on the ceremony, following each ritual gesture with evident understanding and reverence. Hadrian, renowned for his keen judgment of character and intellectual gifts, made inquiries about the boy's background and education. Reports from Marcus's tutors impressed the emperor with accounts of exceptional academic progress and moral development. The boy's compositions in both Latin and Greek demonstrated not only technical proficiency, but also unusual maturity of thought and expression. More significantly, servants and family members consistently described Marcus as kind, honest, and considerate in his daily interactions. The emperor's interest in Marcus reflected broader concerns about imperial succession. Hadrian had no biological sons, and his previous choice of heir, Lucius Aelius Caesar, suffered from poor health that raised questions about his ability to rule effectively. The emperor understood that the stability of the empire depended on smooth transitions of power, requiring careful preparation of future leaders from an early age. During this period, Marcus formed a crucial friendship with Lucius Commodus, son of Hadrian's designated heir, Lucius Aelius Caesar. The two boys, nearly the same age, shared tutors and participated in joint educational activities designed to prepare them for future responsibilities. Lucius, who would later be renamed Lucius Verus, possessed a more outgoing personality than the serious-minded Marcus, but the differences in temperament created a complementary relationship that would endure throughout their lives. Their friendship developed through shared experiences in the imperial court and aristocratic social circles. Both boys attended state ceremonies, religious festivals, and cultural events where they observed the conduct of government and the behavior expected of future leaders. They practiced public speaking together, debated philosophical questions, and engaged in competitive athletic activities that built both physical skills and mutual respect. The philosophical circles that surrounded Rusticus and other Stoic teachers provided Marcus with intellectual companionship beyond his peer relationships. These gatherings, held in private homes or garden settings, brought together senators, equestrians, and other educated Romans interested in serious philosophical discussion. Marcus, despite his youth, participated actively in these conversations, asking thoughtful questions and offering observations that demonstrated his growing understanding of Stoic principles. These philosophical associations exposed Marcus to diverse perspectives within the Stoic tradition. Some participants emphasized the school's political dimensions, arguing that Stoic principles provided the best foundation for just governance and effective leadership. Others focused on personal ethics and individual development, viewing philosophy primarily as a guide for private conduct rather than public policy. Marcus absorbed these different approaches, developing a synthetic understanding that would later inform his approach to imperial administration. The intellectual ferment of Hadrian's court encouraged Marcus's developing interests in literature, history, and natural philosophy. The emperor's personal library, one of the largest private collections in the ancient world, became accessible to the promising young aristocrat. Marcus spent countless hours reading historical accounts of previous emperors, studying military treatises, and examining philosophical works from various schools of thought. His reading extended beyond traditional Roman and Greek authors to include works from the eastern provinces of the empire. Marcus encountered Stoic writings from Asia Minor, Platonic texts from Alexandria, and even some exposure to ideas from India and Persia that had filtered into the Mediterranean intellectual world through trade and diplomatic contacts. This broad exposure to diverse philosophical traditions contributed to the cosmopolitan outlook that would characterize his later reign. Physical training continued to play an important role in Marcus's development during these formative years. Roman military traditions required emperors to demonstrate personal courage and competence in warfare, making martial skills essential for political legitimacy. Marcus learned swordplay from experienced gladiatorial trainers, practiced archery with composite bows used by auxiliary cavalry units, and studied siege engineering through scale models and mathematical calculations. Hunting expeditions provided opportunities to apply military skills in practical settings while building relationships with other young aristocrats. These excursions, typically lasting several days, took place on estates outside Rome, where participants tracked wild boar, deer, and other game animals. Marcus demonstrated competence rather than exceptional skill in these activities, earning respect through steady performance and good judgment rather than spectacular achievements. The social aspects of aristocratic education proved equally important in preparing Marcus for future leadership responsibilities. He learned to navigate the complex protocols of Roman high society, understanding the subtle distinctions of rank and precedence that governed interactions among the elite. Dinner parties, theatrical performances, and religious ceremonies provided venues for observing and practicing the social skills necessary for effective political leadership. Marcus's reputation for integrity and serious purpose spread throughout aristocratic circles during his teenage years. Unlike many young Romans from wealthy families, he avoided the gambling, drinking, and sexual adventures that typically characterized aristocratic youth culture. Instead, he devoted himself to philosophical study, literary pursuits, and preparation for the responsibilities that seemed increasingly likely to come his way. The combination of exceptional intellectual gifts, moral character, and aristocratic connections positioned Marcus uniquely within the imperial court. His philosophical interests aligned with Hadrian's own intellectual pursuits, while his family background provided the social credentials necessary for acceptance among the traditional Roman elite. Most importantly, his demonstrated commitment to duty and service suggested the temperament required for effective imperial leadership. The death of Emperor Hadrian on July 10th, 138 CE, marked the beginning of the most transformative period in Marcus's young life. As the imperial funeral procession wound through Rome's streets, 17-year-old Marcus stood among the imperial family members, acutely aware that his destiny was about to change dramatically. The new emperor, Antoninus Pius, had received Hadrian's final instructions regarding the succession, instructions that would elevate Marcus from a promising young aristocrat to the heir apparent of the Roman Empire. Antoninus Pius, born Titus Aurelius Fulvus Boionius Arius Antoninus, had served as consul and governed the province of Asia with distinction before Hadrian selected him as successor. At 51 years old, he possessed the administrative experience and steady temperament that Hadrian believed necessary for imperial leadership. More crucially for Marcus's future, Antoninus had agreed to adopt both Marcus and Lucius Commodus as part of the succession arrangement. The formal adoption ceremony took place in the Campus Martius before a gathering of senators, magistrates, and representatives from throughout the empire. Marcus, dressed in a pristine white toga with the narrow purple stripe of equestrian rank, stood beside Antoninus as the emperor recited the ancient legal formulas that would make him a member of the Antonine family. The ceremony transformed Marcus Annius Verus into Marcus Aurelius Aurelius Verus, linking him legally and dynastically to the imperial house. The adoption brought immediate changes to Marcus's daily routine and living arrangements. He moved from his family's residence on the Celian Hill to apartments within the imperial palace complex on the Palatine Hill, a sprawling collection of interconnected buildings that had grown organically over the centuries as successive emperors added their own architectural contributions. Marcus's new quarters, decorated with frescoes depicting mythological scenes and furnished with tables of rare marble and bronze, reflected his elevated status while maintaining the relative simplicity that characterized Antoninus's household management style. Antoninus Pius approached Marcus's education with the systematic thoroughness that had marked his own rise through the imperial bureaucracy. Rather than relying solely on private tutors and philosophical discussions, the emperor insisted that his adopted son gain practical experience in the actual mechanics of Roman governance. Marcus began attending meetings of the imperial council, where he observed discussions of provincial administration, military logistics, legal disputes, and financial planning that affected millions of people across 3 continents. These council sessions, held in a marble-lined chamber overlooking the Circus Maximus, provided Marcus with unprecedented insight into the complexities of imperial decision-making. He watched as Antoninus balanced competing demands from provincial governors seeking additional troops, senators advocating for public works projects in their home regions, and military commanders requesting resources for frontier defense. The emperor's patient consideration of multiple perspectives and his insistence on thorough investigation before reaching decisions became models that Marcus would later emulate in his own reign. The administrative apprenticeship extended beyond passive observation to active participation in governmental functions. Antoninus assigned Marcus to review petitions from individuals and communities seeking imperial intervention in local disputes, tax assessments, and legal matters. These documents, written on papyrus scrolls and delivered by official couriers from provinces as distant as Britain and Egypt, exposed Marcus to the diverse challenges facing imperial subjects and the practical limitations of central authority in addressing local problems. Marcus's work with petitions revealed the human dimension of imperial governance that philosophical treatises could not convey. A request from a veteran seeking land grants in Pannonia, a complaint from merchants about corrupt tax collectors in Gaul, or an appeal from a provincial city requesting funds to repair earthquake damage required not only legal knowledge, but also understanding of economic conditions, military requirements, and political sensitivities that varied dramatically across the empire's vast territories. The year 145 CE brought Marcus's marriage to Aeneia Galeria Faustina, known as Faustina the Younger, daughter of Antoninus Pius. The marriage, planned as part of the dynastic arrangements established by Hadrian, would strengthen Marcus's position within the imperial family while continuing the Antonine line through any children the union might produce. Faustina, approximately 4 years younger than Marcus, had received the education typical of aristocratic Roman women, including instruction in literature, music, household management, and the social skills necessary for imperial court life. The formal wedding celebration demonstrated the wealth and ceremonial sophistication of the Antonine court. The ceremony began at dawn with religious rituals conducted by the Pontifex Maximus, followed by the exchange of vows in the presence of hundreds of guests representing the highest levels of Roman society. The wedding feast, held in the palace's largest dining hall, featured delicacies imported from throughout the empire, including oysters from Britain, wine from the Rhine Valley, spices from India, and silk garments from China. Marcus approached marriage with the same serious sense of duty that characterized his attitude toward other responsibilities. He understood that his relationship with Faustina carried political and dynastic implications beyond personal happiness, but he also sought to build a genuine partnership based on mutual respect and shared commitment to family welfare. Contemporary sources suggest that the marriage, while arranged for political purposes, developed into a relationship of considerable affection and mutual support. The early years of Marcus's marriage were marked by both joy and tragedy, as Faustina bore a succession of children, many of whom died in infancy or early childhood. Their first child, a daughter named Aeneia Aurelia Galeria Faustina, was born in 147 CE but survived only a few months. Subsequent pregnancies produced both sons and daughters, though the high infant mortality rates typical of the ancient world meant that only a few would reach adulthood. The deaths of his children profoundly affected Marcus's philosophical development and emotional maturity. Each loss reinforced Stoic teachings about the transient nature of human attachments and the importance of accepting fate with dignity and composure. Marcus's private writings from this period reveal his struggle to reconcile paternal love with philosophical acceptance of mortality. These personal experiences with grief and loss would later inform his approach to imperial leadership during times of crisis and tragedy. Marcus's philosophical education continued throughout this period under the guidance of several distinguished teachers who expanded his understanding beyond the Stoic tradition. Apollonius of Chalcedon, a renowned rhetorician, refined Marcus's public speaking skills and taught him to craft persuasive arguments that could influence diverse audiences. Sextus of Chaeronea, grandson of the famous biographer Plutarch, introduced him to Platonic philosophy and helped him understand the relationships between different schools of ancient thought. The most significant philosophical influence during Marcus's apprenticeship years came from Junius Rusticus, who continued to serve as both mentor and friend despite his advancing age. Rusticus introduced Marcus to the personal writings of Epictetus, including lecture notes and private correspondence that revealed the practical application of Stoic principles to daily challenges. These texts, written in clear, direct language without academic pretension, resonated deeply with Marcus's preference for philosophical guidance that addressed real-world problems rather than abstract speculation. Under Rusticus's direction, Marcus began developing the systematic approach to self-examination and moral reflection that would eventually produce his famous Meditations. He established daily routines of philosophical contemplation, typically conducted in the early morning hours before official duties began, when he could reflect on Stoic teachings and their application to his own conduct and responsibilities. These sessions involved not only reading classical texts, but also writing personal observations and reminders that helped reinforce philosophical principles. The progression of Marcus's official responsibilities accelerated during the 150s as Antoninus gradually transferred more authority to his designated successor. In 147 CE, Marcus received tribunician power, the constitutional foundation of imperial authority that granted him the right to propose legislation, veto senatorial actions, and exercise judicial functions. This appointment, unprecedented for someone who had not yet held the praetorship, reflected Antoninus's confidence in Marcus's abilities and his commitment to ensuring a smooth succession. The tribunician power brought Marcus into direct involvement with legislative processes and judicial appeals that affected millions of imperial subjects. He learned to evaluate proposed laws for their practical implications and constitutional compatibility, considering not only immediate effects, but also long-term consequences for imperial administration and social stability. His approach to these responsibilities reflected both his philosophical training and his practical experience with governmental operations, emphasizing careful deliberation and consultation with experts before reaching decisions. By the late 150s, Marcus had evolved from a promising young aristocrat into a capable administrator and designated imperial successor whose abilities commanded respect throughout the Roman elite. His combination of philosophical depth, practical experience, and personal integrity positioned him to assume the full responsibilities of imperial leadership when circumstances would eventually require the transition from apprentice to emperor. The morning of March 7th, 161 CE, dawned gray and cold over Rome, with a bitter wind sweeping down from the Alban hills that seemed to carry omens of change. Within the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill, Emperor Antoninus Pius lay dying in his private chambers, his breathing shallow and labored after several days of declining health. The 74-year-old emperor, who had ruled with unprecedented stability and prosperity for nearly 23 years, was finally succumbing to the fever that had gripped him since returning from his villa at Lorium. Marcus Aurelius, now 39 years old and bearing the weathered features of a man who had spent decades preparing for this moment, maintained a vigil beside the imperial bed alongside other members of the imperial household. The death of Antoninus Pius occurred without the dramatic final speeches or deathbed revelations that characterized the passing of some earlier emperors. Instead, the emperor simply closed his eyes during the afternoon hours and ceased breathing, his face maintaining the serene expression that had marked his approach to both life and governance. Marcus, who had been reading correspondence from provincial governors while waiting for any change in the emperor's condition, immediately set aside his documents and began the carefully orchestrated process of imperial transition that had been planned for years. The immediate hours following Antoninus's death revealed the effectiveness of the succession arrangements that had been established during Marcus's long apprenticeship. The formal announcement of Antoninus's death and Marcus's succession took place that evening in the Praetorian camp, where the elite guards who protected the emperor and maintained order in Rome had assembled to hear the news. Marcus appeared before the assembled soldiers wearing the purple cloak that symbolized imperial authority, his tall frame and graying beard lending gravity to the moment. The Praetorians, who had known Marcus for years through his involvement in palace affairs, acclaimed him as emperor without hesitation, their shouts echoing off the stone walls of the camp's assembly hall. Marcus's first major decision as emperor proved to be one of his most controversial and historically significant choices. Rather than assuming sole imperial authority in the traditional manner, he announced his intention to share power with Lucius Verus, his adoptive brother and longtime companion, who would serve as co-emperor with equal constitutional authority. This unprecedented arrangement shocked many senators and court officials who had expected Marcus to follow conventional precedent by ruling alone while designating Lucius as his eventual successor. The decision to establish a dual emperorship reflected Marcus's philosophical conviction that effective governance required recognition of human limitations and the distribution of responsibilities among capable individuals. His years of administrative experience had taught him that the empire's vast territories and complex challenges exceeded the capacity of any single ruler to manage effectively. By sharing authority with Lucius, who possessed complementary skills in military leadership and diplomatic negotiation, Marcus believed he could provide more effective governance while reducing the personal burden of absolute power that had worn down previous emperors. The early months of the dual emperorship tested the viability of shared authority as both rulers worked to establish effective coordination mechanisms while maintaining the appearance of unified leadership. Daily meetings between the emperors and their respective advisors became routine, with detailed discussions of policy decisions and careful documentation of agreements to prevent misunderstandings or conflicts. The imperial secretariat, staffed by experienced freedmen who had served under Antoninus, adapted their procedures to accommodate the new arrangement while maintaining the efficiency that had characterized imperial administration for decades. The tranquil early months of Marcus Aurelius's reign came to an abrupt end in the late summer of 161 CE, when urgent dispatches arrived from the eastern provinces bearing news that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the new dual emperorship. The messages, carried by exhausted cavalry messengers who had ridden relay horses across Anatolia and the Balkans, brought reports of massive Parthian military movements along the Euphrates frontier and the complete destruction of a Roman legion in Armenia. King Vologases IV of Parthia, who had ruled the sprawling Iranian Empire for over 2 decades, had apparently decided that the transition of power in Rome presented an opportune moment to challenge Roman hegemony in the contested borderlands between the two great powers. The Parthian monarch, operating from his winter capital at Ctesiphon on the Tigris River, had spent months assembling a massive military coalition that included not only his own heavily armored cavalry forces, but also contingents from vassal kingdoms throughout Mesopotamia and the Iranian plateau. The initial Parthian offensive had focused on Armenia, the mountainous kingdom that had served as a buffer state between the two empires since the settlement negotiated under Emperor Nero nearly a century earlier. Roman forces stationed in Armenia, consisting primarily of auxiliary units supported by a single legion detachment, found themselves completely outmatched by the scale and coordination of the Parthian assault. The 9th Hispana Legion, which had been transferred from Britain to reinforce the eastern frontier, suffered catastrophic losses in a series of engagements near the fortress city of Artaxata. After extensive deliberation with experienced military commanders and careful review of intelligence reports from eastern provinces, the emperors decided that Lucius Verus should personally lead a massive expeditionary force to restore Roman authority in Armenia and Mesopotamia. This decision reflected both practical considerations about military leadership and the constitutional logic of the dual emperorship arrangement. Lucius possessed extensive experience with frontier warfare from his service along the Danube, while his more aggressive temperament and natural charisma made him better suited than the philosophically minded Marcus for the demands of active campaigning in hostile territory. The mobilization effort required to support Lucius Verus's eastern expedition demonstrated the impressive organizational capabilities that Roman military administration had developed over centuries of frontier warfare. Legions stationed in Pannonia, Moesia, and Germania received orders to prepare selected cohorts for transfer to eastern staging areas, while auxiliary units from throughout the European provinces contributed specialized troops, including archers, cavalry, and siege engineers. Lucius Verus established his headquarters at Antioch, the magnificent Syrian capital whose strategic location and excellent harbor facilities made it an ideal base for coordinating military operations throughout the Eastern Theater. The city, with its broad colonnaded streets and impressive public buildings, provided accommodations for the expanded imperial staff while offering access to local merchants and craftsmen who could supply specialized equipment needed for desert warfare. The first major Roman success came in 163 CE when combined legionary and auxiliary forces under the command of Statius Priscus successfully invaded Armenia and restored Roman control over key strategic positions. The campaign, characterized by rapid movement and aggressive pursuit of retreating Parthian forces, culminated in the recapture of Artaxata and the installation of a new Armenian king loyal to Roman interests. The Mesopotamian offensive launched in 164 CE under the direct command of Avidius Cassius achieved spectacular initial success that exceeded even optimistic Roman expectations. Roman forces, advancing in coordinated columns supported by extensive cavalry screens and mobile artillery, overwhelmed Parthian defensive positions and captured a series of fortified cities that controlled key river crossings and trade routes throughout the region. The climax of Roman success came with the capture of Ctesiphon, the Parthian winter capital located on the east bank of the Tigris River. The assault on this heavily fortified city, protected by massive walls and defended by the elite units of the Parthian royal guard, required sophisticated siege techniques and sustained combat that tested Roman military capabilities to their limits. The eventual fall of Ctesiphon represented the most significant Roman victory in the East since the campaigns of Trajan half a century earlier. However, the very success of Roman arms in Mesopotamia created new strategic challenges and unintended consequences that would soon overshadow military achievements. The returning legions, flushed with victory and laden with Parthian treasure, unknowingly carried with them a devastating plague that would transform the Eastern triumph into a catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. The disease, likely a virulent strain of smallpox previously unknown in the Mediterranean world, had apparently originated in the densely populated regions of Mesopotamia. The plague that Roman legions had unknowingly carried westward from Mesopotamia reached Rome itself in the spring of 166 CE, transforming the imperial capital from a bustling metropolis of over 1 million inhabitants into a city gripped by terror and death. The disease arrived with a merchant caravan from Antioch, spreading first through the crowded tenements of the Subura district where poor Romans lived in multi-story apartment buildings with inadequate sanitation and ventilation. Marcus Aurelius confronted this unprecedented public health crisis with the systematic approach that characterized his administration of other imperial challenges. The emperor established emergency medical stations in public buildings throughout Rome, staffing them with physicians recruited from across the Mediterranean world and supplemented by military medics who had gained experience treating plague victims in the eastern provinces. The emperor's personal involvement in plague response efforts demonstrated his commitment to Stoic principles of duty and service, even at considerable personal risk. Marcus regularly visited medical stations, speaking with physicians about treatment methods and observing the care provided to victims from all social classes. His presence in plague-affected areas provided visible evidence of imperial concern while boosting morale among medical personnel and civic officials struggling to maintain basic services under catastrophic conditions. The plague's impact on Rome's urban infrastructure created cascading crises that tested the administrative capabilities of imperial government. The death toll among essential workers, including aqueduct maintenance crews, sewer cleaners, and grain distribution personnel, threatened the basic systems that sustained urban life for the capital's massive population. Marcus authorized emergency recruitment of replacement workers from rural areas, offering substantial wage premiums and legal protections to attract volunteers willing to enter the plague-stricken city. Marcus responded to these economic challenges with innovative financial measures that demonstrated both pragmatic flexibility and deep understanding of imperial fiscal management. The emperor authorized the release of substantial funds from the imperial treasury's reserve accounts to provide emergency assistance to affected communities and industries. Rather than simply distributing money indiscriminately, however, Marcus implemented targeted programs designed to maintain economic stability while encouraging recovery efforts. Natural disasters compounded the challenges facing Marcus's administration as the plague continued its devastating progress throughout the Mediterranean world. The winter of 166 to 167 CE brought exceptionally severe weather that caused the Tiber River to freeze solid for the first time in living memory, disrupting river traffic that normally supplied Rome with grain, olive oil, and other essential commodities. When spring floods followed the harsh winter, the swollen Tiber overflowed its banks and inundated large sections of the city. The death of Lucius Verus in 169 CE removed Marcus's co-emperor and closest collaborator at the moment when imperial unity and experienced leadership were most crucial for managing the ongoing crisis. Lucius had contracted the plague while returning from his successful eastern campaigns, succumbing to the disease at Altinum in northern Italy while traveling towards Rome for consultations about frontier defense and domestic recovery efforts. As the devastating plague continued to ravage the empire's population centers throughout 169 CE, urgent dispatches began arriving in Rome from the northern frontiers that would force Marcus Aurelius to confront an entirely different category of crisis. The messages brought increasingly alarming reports of massive barbarian movements beyond the river frontier. Germanic tribal confederations, apparently emboldened by intelligence regarding the empire's internal difficulties, had begun massing in unprecedented numbers along the northern banks of the Danube. The intelligence reports reaching Marcus's council chambers painted a picture of coordinated barbarian planning that suggested a level of strategic thinking previously unknown among the Germanic peoples. The Marcomanni, a powerful confederation based in modern-day Bohemia, had apparently entered into alliance negotiations with the Quadi of modern Slovakia, the Iazyges from the Hungarian plain, and numerous smaller tribes whose territories stretched from the headwaters of the Danube to the shores of the Baltic Sea. The first major barbarian incursion occurred in late autumn 169 CE when a combined force of Marcomannic and Quadi warriors crossed the Danube near the Roman fortress of Carnuntum, overwhelming the reduced garrison and establishing a fortified bridgehead on the southern bank of the river. The attack, launched during a moonless night when Roman sentries had difficulty detecting the approaching boats, achieved complete tactical surprise and resulted in the destruction of two auxiliary cohorts that had been stationed to guard the crossing point. Marcus Aurelius received news of the Carnuntum disaster while presiding over a Senate session devoted to plague relief measures. The emperor's immediate response demonstrated both his military acumen and his understanding of the strategic implications of barbarian success. Rather than attempting to coordinate the frontier response from Rome, Marcus recognized that the crisis demanded personal imperial leadership and the commitment of substantial military resources that could only be effectively deployed under direct imperial command. The emperor's decision to establish his field headquarters at Aquileia, the prosperous commercial city located at the head of the Adriatic Sea, reflected both strategic and practical considerations that would influence the conduct of the entire northern campaign. Aquileia's location provided excellent communications with Rome while offering convenient access to the Alpine passes that connected Italy with the Danubian provinces. The city's substantial commercial infrastructure could support the massive logistical requirements of a major military expedition. The winter of 169 to 170 CE brought unprecedented barbarian advances that carried Germanic war bands across the Alps and into northern Italy itself, creating panic in Roman cities that had not faced foreign invasion for over 2 centuries. The Marcomanni and Quadi, reinforced by Sarmatian cavalry units whose mobility allowed them to outflank Roman defensive positions, penetrated as far south as Opitergium, less than 50 miles from Aquileia, where Marcus had established his headquarters. The siege of Aquileia during the early months of 170 CE tested both Marcus's personal courage and his strategic judgment as barbarian forces surrounded the city and attempted to capture the emperor himself. Marcus's conduct during the siege demonstrated the Stoic principles that had guided his philosophical development while revealing practical leadership skills that had been largely theoretical during his previous administrative career. The emperor personally inspected the city's defensive preparations, speaking with individual soldiers and civilian volunteers who manned the walls while maintaining the calm demeanor that inspired confidence among defenders facing seemingly overwhelming odds. The composition of Marcus's meditations began during these months of siege and campaign as the emperor sought to maintain philosophical perspective while confronting the immediate realities of warfare and the broader challenges facing the empire. The emperor's private writings, composed in Greek during quiet moments between military conferences and battlefield inspections, revealed his ongoing struggle to reconcile Stoic ideals with the practical necessities of military command and imperial leadership. The relief of Aquileia came through a coordinated assault by Roman forces that had been assembled from garrisons throughout northern Italy and reinforcements rushed from other provinces. The successful defense of Aquileia marked a turning point in both the immediate military crisis and Marcus's development as a military commander. The emperor's personal courage during the siege had earned the respect of professional soldiers who had initially questioned whether a philosopher emperor could provide effective battlefield leadership. The spring of 175 CE brought Marcus Aurelius his first taste of victory in the grueling northern campaigns when the combined forces of Marcomanni and Quadi finally agreed to comprehensive peace terms that promised to stabilize the Danubian frontier. The peace negotiations required extraordinary patience as Germanic tribal councils debated terms through elaborate ceremonial procedures. But Marcus understood that lasting agreements demanded respect for barbarian political traditions rather than simple Roman dictation of surrender terms. Marcus's satisfaction with the northern settlement proved tragically short-lived when a dust-covered messenger arrived at Sirmium in early April bearing devastating news from the eastern provinces. Lucius Avidius Cassius, the capable general who had achieved spectacular success during the Parthian campaigns and subsequently served as governor of Syria, had proclaimed himself emperor in Antioch and secured the allegiance of the wealthy eastern provinces that formed the empires.